believed that God was always about half-ticked with him, always out to get him. And this is something that Luther has to overcome. And Luther overcoming this warped view of God is an important part of the Reformation. In 2000, A&E Channel they have a series on there called Biography, and they were doing a list of the 100 most influential people of the past 1,000 years. And being a historian, I taught at a little school in Georgia at the time, I decided to make my own top 10 list because you didn't know who was going to come out, and they did these hour biographies of the last 50, and I watched almost all of them. I don't remember my top 10 list, but I do remember who I chose as the most influential person of the past 1,000 years. I chose Martin Luther, leader of the Protestant Reformation. Let me give you a top 10 rundown from 10 to 1. Number 10, voted by these scholars and historians, was Galileo, the father of modern science. Number 9 was Copernicus. Number 8 was another scientist, Albert Einstein. Number 7 was Karl Marx, Communist Manifesto, Das Kapital. Number 6 was Christopher Columbus, opening up the New World, even though he didn't know he discovered a new world. Number 5 was William Shakespeare. Number 4 was Charles Darwin, Origin of Species, Evolution, Impact on Science and Religion. Number 3 was Martin Luther. So I came close. My number 1 was their number 3. To close it out, number 2 in their vote was the father, kind of the grand synthesizer of the scientific revolution, Isaac Newton. And number 1 was Johann Gutenberg, and the movable type and the printing press as the most influential person of the past millennium, as revolutionary at the time as the internet has been in our own time. A big anniversary, a big birthday is coming up in October. On Halloween, October 31st, 2017, it's the 500th anniversary of the signature event of the Protestant Revolution, Martin Luther nailing the 95 Theses to the castle church door in Wittenberg. 50 years ago, cover of Time magazine, March. On the cover is Martin Luther. It was the 450th anniversary of that event. So Luther's a big deal. Now the question is Luther a hero or is Luther a villain? Well, it depends on who you talk to. I knew what he was in my own education. I went to a small evangelical Protestant college, and so Luther was a heroic figure. I went to a Protestant seminary. But when I went to the University of Kentucky to do my graduate work, I had to ask the question, what do I do with my childhood heroic view of Martin Luther? How do you evaluate these gigantic events and these influential characters to look at them with nuance, the pros and the cons? So look at Luther, warts and all, if you will. There's a book I use for a class I teach on World War II. The book is by Michael Bess. It's called Choices Under Fire, Moral Dimensions of World War II. And he teaches at the University of Tennessee. And Michael Bess, as an American, looks at both sides of the Second World War and moral issues and moral dimensions. And he says there are really two hats that he wears as a historian. He said the first hat that he wears represents what he calls a stance of celebration. He's an American studying the Second World War. And so he wants to participate in a celebration that tells the story of the drama and the sacrifice and really the heroic victory over Nazi Germany, the Allied victory. But he says as a historian, we also need to wear another hat. And he calls this the hat that represents the stance of critical scrutiny. As we look at historical figures, as we look at historical events, in order to tell the full story with honesty and integrity. There's a historian who used to teach at Calvin College, Ron Wells, and Ron Wells has a book called History Through the Eyes of Faith. And he talks about something he calls honest history. And Ron Wells says that honest history means more than getting the dates right, more than getting the factual terms right. He says it also means telling the truth in all of its ambiguity and complexity. And you think of what we know about King David in the Bible, because I think the Hebrews do this very thing. We know that David is a man after God's own heart. God says that. But we know about David's adultery. We know about David's cover-up. We know about David's murder of Bathsheba's husband. because the Hebrews look at all it means to be human, the human condition. And so I want to do that. I want to honor that as a historian who also happens to be a Christian. And Ron Wells also says, you know what, there's sometimes our side does the wrong thing, and their side, whoever there is, whoever they are, and their side does the right thing. And we want to look at that, and we want to see that, we want to acknowledge that. So in this year of celebration for Protestants, the 500th anniversary, what can we say about Luther? What can we say about the Reformation that looks at the complexity of such an event, of such a person, that engages in honest history, that tells us something about the discipline of history, and I think even tells us something about the value of the study of history? Martin Luther was born on November 10th in 1483 in what was still called the Middle Ages. Eisleben, Germany, eventually became Germany. It was the Holy Roman Empire at the time. 62 years later, Martin Luther died in Eisleben, Germany. Now, he did travel outside of this small town, but it does say something about Luther. He never traveled very far. I think only one time in his life Luther traveled outside the Holy Roman Empire. He went to Rome in 1510. And he spent most of his life in a small town, Wittenberg, less than 10,000 people, as a monk, as a professor, as a husband, as a reformer. Most of his life is spent there. Let me tell you something about Luther's parents. Luther's parents, Margareta and Hans Luder, originally the family spelled the name L-U-D-E-R. Luther says very little about his mother, but he does tell us this. Luther told us that his mother once beat him for stealing a nut, and she beat him until he bled. Now, this was probably kind of typical parenting at the time in the 15th century. But I say this not to say something bad about Luther's mother, but to say something about the picture of God that Luther developed. One of my all-time favorite quotes comes from an Archbishop of Canterbury. William Temple was the Archbishop of Canterbury, the Church of England, during World War II. And William Temple had this quote. He says, "If you begin with a wrong picture of God, the more religious you become, the more dangerous you are to yourself and to other people." And I think for a long time, Luther had a wrong picture of God. He had a partial picture of God. He had a warped view of God, and God was the judge. And Luther believed that God was always about half-ticked with him, always out to get him. And this is something that Luther has to overcome. And Luther overcoming this warped view of God is an important part of the Reformation. Luther's father, Hans, was, these are German peasants, but they're not destitute, they're not poor. Luther's father actually owns copper mines. And so they had money. They could send their son off to boarding school. They sent Luther off to university to get an education. And by the time Luther was 21 years old, he had a bachelor's degree from the University of Erfurt, and he had a master's degree. And now he was going to go off and get a professional degree. You could get a doctorate in one of three disciplines. You could get a doctorate in medicine, you could get a doctorate in law, or you could get a doctorate in theology. And Luther was going to go to law school. And his father was very proud. My son, the lawyer, can take care of me and mother in our old age. And so Luther is off, and it's the summer break of 1505. Luther's a law student. And he's coming home, and on July the 2nd, Luther is caught in the midst of a raging thunderstorm. Do you know this story? And Luther is terrified. And who's he terrified of? Not the devil, of God. It's God who's always angry with Luther. It's God who's in charge of weather. It's God who's in charge of lightning and lightning bolts. And so Luther said he fell to the ground. He cried out, "Saint Anne, save me, and I will become a monk." And he drops out of law school. And 2 weeks later, he enters a monastery in the same town, in Erfurt. And Luther, he said, he went into the monastery to really save his soul. He thought, this is what will impress God. Now we have our own version of this, don't we? Of what will get God's attention. Oh, if I do this, I can then get God to love me, to accept me. So Luther is going to monk his way to heaven. And he's going to out-monk all the other monks. But Luther has this tremendous view, this high and lofty view of the holiness of God, the righteousness of God. And he has a crushing view of his own sinfulness, of his own shortcomings. And he does not know how to cross that chasm. He doesn't know how to fill that gap. He knows what God requires, righteousness, 100%. And he knows what he performs, even though he is out-monking all the other monks. Luther goes to the confession, and he's in the confessional typically for 2 hours at a time. And he'll leave, and then 15 minutes later he comes back. Oh, I thought of something else. He's trying to remember every sin he's ever committed, that by confessing he can get God to accept him and love him. He once was in the confessional, believe it or not, 6 consecutive hours. That's a long day. That's Luther, trying to out-monk everyone. Luther's, he was the head of the Augustinian order, this monastery that Luther is a member of. His name was Staupitz, Johann von Staupitz. And John Staupitz sends Luther off to become a professor of Bible, to get a doctorate now, not in law, but in theology. And Luther begins to study, and I think the 2 greatest intellectual, theological influences on Luther, one's biblical and one's a church father. The biblical author, not surprisingly, is the Apostle Paul. He writes half the New Testament. And the other is the towering church father, St. Augustine, or St. Augustine, Augustine of Hippo. And Luther is an Augustinian monk, Augustine who dies in 430, early church father. Incredibly influential, especially in Western Christianity, both on Catholics and on Protestants, because it comes by way of Luther and the Reformation. So Luther is teaching Paul's letters. He's teaching Ephesians. He's teaching Galatians. But mostly it's teaching the book of Romans. And Luther, he says there's this expression that he came across numerous times in his teaching, his study of the book of Romans. And the phrase was the righteousness of God. And Luther said every time he came across that expression, the righteousness of God, it filled him with dread and terror. Because what Luther hears is, God is righteous. And what Luther hears is, and you are not. So this is not gospel. This is not good news to Luther. This is just more bad news. It all sounds kind of like bad news to Luther. Even as a professor of Bible. And he's wrestling with this, 1515, 1516, 1517. And then Luther sees something one day in a passage in Romans chapter 1. And Paul says, I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for the salvation of everyone who believes, first for the Jew, then for the Gentile. In verse 17, Paul says, for in the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed. So there's that expression that Luther thought he hated. A righteousness from God is revealed, a righteousness that is by faith from first to last. And then Paul quotes Habakkuk. For the righteous, the just, will live by faith. And Luther says, whoa, 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 wait a minute. This is not talking about the righteousness with which God is righteous. This is talking about the righteousness by which we are made righteous, because God's not righteous by faith, is he? No, God's righteous in his essence. We are righteous by faith. And so Luther starts to see something. In Romans chapter 3, it says this, therefore no one will be declared righteous in God's sight by observing the law. You can't monk your way to heaven. Rather, through the law, we become conscious of sin. Verse 21, but now a righteousness from God, apart from the law, has been made known, to which the law and the prophets testify. A righteousness that comes from God through faith in Jesus Christ to all who believe. And all of a sudden, this starts sounding like good news. This starts sounding like gospel to Luther. Luther had once said, if I could ever believe that God was not angry with me, I would stand on my head for joy. And all of a sudden, the gospel starts to sound like gospel. And Luther thought everybody is going to be as excited about this as he is. Next door to Luther's province, Luther lives in a region called Saxony. And there is a Dominican friar who is selling indulgences. He's an important part. You'll hear his name in October with all this stuff going on. His name is Tetzel. John Tetzel, a seller of indulgences. And Tetzel is really playing on people's fear and manipulating. Tetzel was doing this in such a way that the Catholic Church eventually condemns Tetzel. And this is what first stirs Luther up, this kind of what he sees as a corruption, kind of a scam, a money-making venture to, in one sense, help pay for St. Peter's and pay off a loan. That's all very complicated. Tetzel has a little ditty that he sings as he's selling indulgences, and Luther writes about it in his 95 Theses. It goes like this. What people had come to believe indulgences could do, they started with the Crusades, but now, in the century before Luther, an indulgence could lessen the time of loved ones in purgatory. And so you might be able to lessen the time that grandma or Aunt Brunhilde or somebody in purgatory that you know. And so Tetzel says, every time a coin in the coffer rings, a soul from purgatory springs. And Luther hears this, and Luther is absolutely livid, and he's furious. And this is why he writes the 95 Theses. The 95 Theses are mainly about the selling of indulgences. It's not Luther's clear articulation of the gospel. You really find that in other works of Luther. And so on October 31st, 1517, Luther nails the 95 Theses up. And here's where Gutenberg comes into the story as well, because this is translated from Latin into German. It's slapped on the printing press, and before you know it, in a matter of weeks, it's disseminated all over Europe. And people are reading what Luther originally intended to be a discussion among the scholars at the university in Wittenberg. But now it's going big because of Gutenberg and his printing press. Over the next 3 years, Luther started attacking what he saw as corruption and abuses. There had been, and remember, Luther's a Catholic reformer. He's a monk. There had been other Catholics who were interested in reform before and after Luther. And Erasmus is one, if you know Erasmus, or Savonarola in the Italian Renaissance. And they even would attack what they saw as corrupt popes. Luther began to do something differently. Luther stopped just talking about corruption in the church, and he started to disagree with the Catholic Church even at its best. Luther, and Protestants and Catholics believe in the gospel, and they believe in the importance of faith and grace. We're all agreed there. But Luther begins to articulate the gospel in a way that is still controversial. Because Luther says things like, we are saved by grace alone, through faith alone. And that's a Protestant way of talking. It's not a Catholic way of talking. And so there is a controversy connected with Luther's articulation of the gospel. Luther finds himself, by the end of 1520, having been excommunicated from the church. And now Luther is called before the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, who also happens to be the king of Spain. This guy is incredibly powerful, rules these two large territories. Charles V, ruler of the Habsburg dynasty. And in April 1521, Luther, who's already outside the church, he's been excommunicated, now he's going to be tried for treason. This is a Christian society, and everybody is expected to be Christian. So there's controversy here connected to Luther. And this is where Luther gives his famous "Here I Stand" speech. Will you recant? That's the question. Will you recant? Will you take these things back? Let me read you part of Luther's response. Luther says to the emperor, Charles V, unless I am convinced by the testimony of Holy Scriptures or by plain reason, I can believe neither popes nor councils alone, as it is clear they have erred repeatedly and contradicted themselves. I consider myself convicted by the testimony of Holy Scripture, which is my basis. My conscience is captive to the Word of God. Thus I cannot and will not recant, because acting against one's conscience is neither safe nor sound. Here I stand. I cannot do otherwise. God help me. Amen. So a courageous moment for Luther, and this is partly what will be celebrated in 2021, where in many ways the Reformation is really kind of picking up steam now, more so than the nailing of the 95 Theses. There is good. There is much to admire. I think of course, I'm a Protestant. There's much to celebrate with Luther and the Reformation. But I think we also need to say, you know what, there also is something bad. You have the good, the bad, and sometimes you have the downright ugly with Luther. And something to critique and something to criticize. A legacy to see the complexity, even the messiness, and even the unintended consequences of the Reformation. So I think this is what we do as historians. Some of the good, this recovery of the gospel. One of my favorite theologians to this day, Luther, are talking about the gospel, something in me leaps up with great joy, something to admire. The gospel is what Christ has done because we could not do it. The law makes demands and bids us obey. The gospel makes promises and bids us believe. Do you trust God? For Luther, faith is trust. Do you trust God? Will He keep His promises? That's the key. And Luther believes that embracing this changes us inwardly. And he articulates that in glorious ways. He writes a treatise in 1520, one of three important treatises, Freedom of a Christian. One of the ripple effects of the Reformation, not only the freedom that Christ has brought spiritually, freedom from the condemnation of the law, for example, but there are implications for freedom of conscience, political freedom, economic freedom, religious toleration. All this will be part of the Reformation legacy. There's something good there. The Catholic Church would agree with that in the 21st century. So that's to be celebrated. Luther translates the Bible into German. And a lot of Protestant countries, the rise of lay literacy is just incredible at this time, because you want to teach people how to read, not just theologians and priests and monks and nuns, but farmers and shoemakers, so that they can read the Bible. And so the rise of mass literacy, this is also part of the legacy of Luther and the Reformation. Married clergy. Luther the monk marries Catherine von Bora the nun. So Luther came out of a monastery, she came out of a convent, and she's not just keeping house, they have 6 kids. I mean, this is a family. This is a marriage, and that becomes part of the legacy as well. Luther songwriting, his hymn, A Mighty Fortress. It was said at Luther's time that by his songs he has done more harm to the Romanists than by his sermons. And so this is also part of that Reformation, some of the external reforms that we live with and enjoy and celebrate. Luther's notion of vocation, that if you're a Christian, everybody has a calling. It's not just for professional religious. It's not just for monks. It's for farmers. It's for bankers. Whatever you do it all to the glory of God, Paul says. So that's part of Luther. But then there's the bad, and I would say even the ugly. There's a peasant rebellion in Germany in 1524. In some ways that Luther had kind of helped stir up. And these peasants are interested now in what this means for them, some of the freedoms that they can fight for. Luther was a rebel against the state, against the church. And when this revolution, this rebellion kind of, in Luther's view, is going to take a violent turn, he wrote a pamphlet. And just the title itself says something about Luther. The title of the pamphlet is Against the Murdering, Thieving Hordes of Peasants. And Luther could be incredibly harsh. And he called on the princes to put down this rebellion with ruthlessness, and they did. And literally tens of thousands of people were killed in the peasant rebellion. Luther could be harsh and critical, not just of Catholic opponents, but of other Protestants. The Reformed tradition, some of you may come from the Reformed tradition. There's kind of 2 strands after about a decade of the Reformation, the Lutherans and the Reformed. The Reformed tradition really was started not by John Calvin, who's most associated with it, but by Ulrich Zwingli. And in 1529, Luther and Zwingli came together to see if Protestants were going to make common cause, be together. And there were 15 issues that they looked at, and they agree on the first 14. The last one was the Lord's Supper. And Zwingli has a view that probably is familiar to many of you from your churches. Zwingli has a view of the Lord's Supper that this is not the body of Christ, this is not the blood of Christ. Luther believes that Jesus is present in the bread, in the wine. And Zwingli says, no, this points to Jesus. This represents his body. It's a memorial. And Luther refuses to shake his hand. He says, I'm not even sure you're a Christian with such a view. So again, Luther's criticism of opponents, and probably the most horrific thing Luther ever wrote. Remember the great biographer of Luther, Roland Baton, wrote a book called Here I Stand. He said, I wish Luther had died before he wrote this pamphlet. In 1543, 3 years before he died, Luther wrote a pamphlet called Concerning the Jews and Their Lies. And it's absolutely blood-curdling. And we need to see that. I mean, he talks about taking their holy books away from them, burning their synagogues. That too is part of Luther. And we need to know that. We need to say that. We need to look at the whole story, just like the Bible does with David, I would say. So something to celebrate and something to critique. So the legacy of the Reformation. Another legacy is the wars of religion that came out of the Reformation. After Luther died, there is a century of religious wars, Protestants against Catholics. Now, you know one of the incredible ironies here? Europe becomes a very secular place in the centuries after Luther. There's a scholar at Notre Dame, Brad Gregory is his name. And Brad Gregory, in a book called The Unintended Reformation, suggests that Luther and the Reformation, in many ways, is responsible for the secularizing of Europe. Because what the Europeans did was they had to push religion out of the public square just as a matter of survival. And so politics was secularized and religion is privatized, pushed to the private sphere. And that's ironic that one of the legacies of the Reformation is to push religion out of the center of life. So this is all part of the celebration. This is all part of what we need to remember and to look at and to own up to, something to celebrate. Salvation is a free gift. But Christianity splintered. Now we have, 30,000 different denominations? And Jesus is praying for our unity. So something there to grieve as well. So the value of history, learning to think critically, to look at the pros and the cons.